All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jacques Gauthier with Carpedia International, and we have an informative session planned for the next 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A period, and it's all around discussing how to realign your business during a crisis. Today's session is hosted by Andrew Rush and Mark Follows of Carpedia International in partnership with CEO Connection. And Carpedia has completed over 900 engagements in the last 26 years, most of which are with mid-market companies. So we believe that sharing our experience with you today should be relevant. We'll hopefully give you a few takeaways on how to get through this crisis. We also have Kenny Beck, the CEO of CEO Connection, will say a few words before we turn it over to Andrew. Kenny?
Oh, thanks. I was muted. So, Mark, you look like Warren Beatty. Anyway, hi, everybody. Hi, Andrew. Hi, Jack. How are you?
Kenny?
All right. So, welcome, everybody. As Jacques said, I am CEO of CEO Connection, and we're the only membership organization in the world that's focused on mid-market CEOs and companies. And we connect you to people, information, resources, and opportunities that enhance your career and save you time and make you money. And here's a great example of access to something that you couldn't get on your own that's remarkable, and that is what the guys at Carpedia are doing today. So other than that, I will say, I hope everybody is healthy and safe. I will say that we have been spending a lot of time over the last 6 to 8 weeks helping both individual members and pushing the U.S. federal government to help mid-market companies, because the reality is the programs that have been rolled out to date have focused on small businesses and the really large companies and our mid-sized companies that account for $10 trillion and 30 million jobs in the U.S. kind of left in the cold, and we need to do something to help them. So we've been pushing the federal government to do what we call a seat at the table for the mid-market. And that's pretty much all I have to say today, other than you're going to get some great information here today from our friends, our strategic partners at Carpedia, and I'm excited that we're doing this. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kenny.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Kenny.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're located. I'm Andrew Rush, a partner with Carpedia, and today I'm going to talk about how to align your business during a crisis, specifically the types of plans and the details within those plans that you should be creating. This crisis has brought about, I think, a new level of anxiety amongst business leaders, and it's because we've lost the control, the influence that we used to have about at least being able to have some level of predictability for the future. And I know for me, I'm spending less time physically working, but more time thinking about work as I play out all of these unknowns and the what if scenarios. Planning was one of those things that as long as I had a good plan in place, I at least had a starting point. And just because there are so many unknowns now, I don't think that means that we shouldn't be planning or spending as much time on it. There are just more scenarios to consider. So today what I'm going to do is share with you what some of those scenarios are. This session is called How to Plan. It's part of a 3-part series, which include how to execute and how to manage. If you're interested in those, there will be dates and times scheduled in the future. So let's talk about the types of plans that we need as businesses to try and simplify our thinking and the framework. We've created 4 types of plans for essential businesses and 4 types of plans for non-essential businesses. And it doesn't mean that if you're an essential business, the non-essential one doesn't apply. It's that there are 4 that we feel are of utmost importance, depending on which bucket your company falls into. So let's start with the essential businesses. The first plan is around demand forecasting and fallout planning. The second one is simplifying your product offering and your operations. The third is your procurement and inventory strategy. And the last one is the new processes that you've got to put in place to be COVID compliant, and the kinds of things you need to be doing to innovate. For non-essential businesses, there are also 4 types of plans. The first is cash management. The second is revenue generation. The third is how you ramp up your organization going through and coming out of the crisis. And the last is, what operating model are you creating that is going to be your business in the next year, 2 years, whenever we get back to the new normal. So I'm going to go into depth on each of those 8 types of plans. Let's start with demand forecasting and fallout planning. We used to be able to plan using some kind of history. That history is no longer relevant, which makes it hard. So we get into running scenarios, as I mentioned before. Some of the things we need to consider are the geographies where the restrictions are going to be lifted first, the types of industries that are going to have increased or decreased demand. There's most likely going to be this move back towards buying locally, which may provide opportunities for you, or it might be a threat. Either way, you've got to think about all these things when you think about how much demand you should be planning on in the future. And when I talk to business leaders about how they're doing their forward planning for demand, they're all doing it. But I would say that they're doing it too generically. They're taking 10, 20, 30% either reduced demand or increased demand, depending on the situation of their business, and they're blanketing that for their forward-looking scenarios. The problem with doing it that way is if you have one customer who is down by 50% and another who is flat, unless they buy the same goods and services from you, it may have very different implications on your business. So when you do your demand planning, now more than ever, I would argue that it's critical that you get down to the customer level and try as best as possible to predict customer by customer what their demand is going to be, so that you've got a more accurate feel for what your new mix is going to be. The more detail you put into it, the better plan you're able to create. For customers or for organizations who have hundreds, maybe thousands of customers, it's not going to be feasible. You'll have to do something like apply the 80-20 rule. The second point is the simplification of products and operations. So customers aren't going to want the bells and whistles as much as they used to in the past. I think about hair care products as an example. A lot of hair salons are offering their clients home delivery or curbside pickup so people can still get their hair done at home. When they open back up, one of the big questions will be, are people going to get used to the fact that they didn't have to spend as much time or spend as much money on those types of service? And or are they, because of their own financial situations, going to be looking for products that are simpler? Either way, it means as an organization, you should be thinking about, if you don't have a simple product offering already, what that could be, because there will be a demand for it. There's some positives that will come out of this. If you're in manufacturing, it could mean fewer setups, changeovers, longer runs. If you're a service-based industry, you might not need the same skill level of the employees that you have. You might invest less or need to invest less in sales and marketing. Regardless of whether you're sales or manufacturing or another type of business, these things will drive your costs down. But there are factors that will also have the opposite effect and drive your costs up that I'm going to get to later. The other thing to consider, though, is that if you sell the same amount of goods, but you're offering a simpler option that's cheaper, your total revenue is going to go down. So that's going to have a net negative impact on your business unless you can simplify and control things on the cost side of the equation. We had a client who's in the aluminum business, and they're in the envious position right now that they can't keep up with demand. So what they've done is they've gone to their customers and said, we still want to supply you as much as possible, but we can't offer you as many products as we did in the past. That's the only way we can meet your demand. So we're not going to offer the slow-moving products, the ones that are taking up a disproportionate amount of time. Same analogy is true if you're a service offering company. Look at it through that lens and figure out what is it that you're going to offer that's going to still satisfy the demand, but not allow your volume or your revenue to drop. On the flip side, then, as a buyer of goods and services, you're also going to want to drop a lot of the bells and whistles. You're going to want to control your costs to a greater degree. And that's going to mean that your inventory strategy will need reevaluating. You may want to hold more inventory if your supply chain isn't very stable, or negotiate with your vendors for them to hold inventory so you don't tie up as much cash. If you're buying from local suppliers, all of those things are going to drive your costs up. There's also this move, as we talk to current and past clients, towards blanket purchase orders. So there are a couple of advantages of doing that you're now moving your inventory back to your vendors, but you're also giving your supply chain a greater level of stability. If you can help them predict to a greater degree how much product you're going to buy from them, you increase the likelihood that you'll get the amount of product you need when you need it in the future. And going back to what I said about predicting customer demand earlier, that's going to have an effect on your supply chain. If that customer who's gone down by 50% has a specific product mix, that may mean that a supplier of yours, your purchases may go down by an equal amount. Are they going to be able to survive that? If it's an increase in demand, do they have the capacity to absorb that? All of those questions will come to the forefront when you get into the details of planning. And those are the kinds of questions that you should be asking. And then lastly, for essential businesses, in order to have an environment where people are comfortable, where you as an employer are providing a good working situation, there are things that you'll need to consider. Obviously, social distancing and making sure people are 6 feet apart, the effect that has on office layouts, traffic patterns in an office or a building. One of our clients is actually having to physically move walls so that people can pass and still maintain that 6 feet. The amount of PPE you have, the barriers, air purification systems, splitting or staggering shifts. All of these things need to be considered when people come back to work. We have one client who's actually hired somebody full-time to monitor risks in the business. And they're wiping down door handles, railings, looking for places that may violate people's health and safety. And they're doing that for two reasons. As I mentioned before, as an employer, you want to minimize your liability. But equally as important, if not more, you want to make an environment that people feel safe and coming back to work in. And if you've read the news lately, the meat packers are currently having a challenge with this. I've been in some meat packing operations, and people are used to working shoulder to shoulder. If the employers don't figure out a way of them coming back and being able to maintain that 6 foot distance, even if they're allowed to open, they may not be able to function because they can't get people back. All of this is going to have an effect on costs of doing business. It's going to drive them up. It's critically important, if you were doing activity-based costing, that you hit the reset button, and if you weren't doing it, that you start to. The cost, the true cost to deliver the goods and services that you're providing, if they haven't changed already, are going to change. Understanding what those true costs are so you can determine what your true margins are on a product by product or service by service basis is important, because if you don't know that, you may be providing things at a loss. You won't have the information to do an evaluation of where you're making or losing money. All of this is going to lead us back to what was very prominent in the 80s and 90s, which was process re-engineering. We're now being forced to do it because we've got all of these new processes, but we don't have the luxury of time. If we don't come up with cost reducing measures quickly, we may find ourselves out of business. So those are the 4 types of plans for an essential business that are required. For non-essential businesses, the first one is cash management. It's simple: collect and conserve. Every business out there right now is doing some sort of cash flow modeling. I think there's 2 important tenets to that. One is, if you're a business that can help, do so. The things that you do now for your vendors and for your customers are going to cement relationships for a lifetime. If you can help by offering discounts, more favorable terms, then do so. The benefit will be there in the future. If you're not in a position, then transparency with your supply chain and your customers is critical. Ask for help if you need it. All the business owners or leaders that I've talked to so far want to see their customers and their vendors survive. They'll do what they can, if they can, to help, but you've got to be transparent about your own situation. What is also critical here for cash management is, like I mentioned earlier, the degree of accuracy you have around your customer demand and the effect that it has on your suppliers. If your product mix changes, you may be getting more favorable or unfavorable terms from your customers that are now making up a greater portion of your sales. If you require more or less of a certain type of good or service from a supplier, the terms that you have to pay them have now changed in totality, and that's going to have an effect on your cash flow. So getting into the detail is critical in order for you to have a more accurate projection. The second point is, what are you doing to generate revenue? And I've mentioned some of this in the demand forecasting and fallout planning session. One of the things that's being talked about all the time is being digital, getting used to it. There are some very critical things that you as an employer can put in place so that your people who are front facing to the customer are doing so in a higher level of professionalism. And those are some physical things, like not just virtual backgrounds, the degree of quality of your audio system, your visual system, hardwiring so you don't have Wi-Fi interruptions. In our business, we're talking about installing green rooms so that we've got a professional background to all of the business owners we're talking to, better than what you see behind me. And all those things are physical changes, but there is also a different skill set now in having these meetings via different software platforms. So evaluate your sales force and think about whether or not your salespeople have the skills needed for the new world. And if not, what kind of investment can you make in training them to be more effective? One of the things that will happen is, if your salespeople are doing more meetings online, doing less travel, then their capacity to sell is going to increase. They can do more meetings. Are you going to add more people, more hours, more horsepower into lead generation to fill that capacity? Or are you not going to need as many salespeople going forward? Either way, what's critical, or one of the things that is critical, is to have a means of tracking that. So is your effectiveness now meeting online going to be the same as it was face-to-face? Is it going to take more meetings to generate the same level of revenue? If you don't start tracking that now, you won't have the information in place in the future to make better decisions. And then, reverting back to what I said about the new products that you're going to offer, are your salespeople trained to sell a simpler product? Do they have the right messaging and literature and all the sorts of things that they need? And what activities can they be doing now in preparation for when it gets back to being okay to start to go out and prospect? How can you keep your pipeline full now so that in the future, when the restrictions are lifted, you hit the ground running? And I think it's critical that as we're idling here, we don't get over anxious, that we do pause and think. It's not that we're not decisive. We do have to decide on a path we're going to take, but the timing of when we take action is going to be critical. And so if we decide that, or you decide that you're now going to go and start to turn the sales engine back on, you may choose to do it only with one of your salespeople in one geography, because the last thing you want to do is go out when it's not appropriate to your customers and start making sales calls. So taking it in small bites to get that sales engine running is critically important. Take an action, pause, evaluate, and then move forward. You're better to be late than to be early with regards to prospecting. The third type of plan for non-essential businesses is how you ramp up the organization coming out of the crisis. It's very frustrating. We've got this calendar that we can't put dates on, but what we can do is figure out what the milestones or the triggers are that are going to allow us to start to do some activities. So if you can identify what those triggers are and move backwards from there and figure out, okay, these are the types of messages we're going to start to convey. These are the types of people and the number of people that we're going to need in place beforehand, accounting for training and those sorts of things. The materials we're going to need to order in advance. You can start to do some of those planning activities, and then when that trigger does get announced, you've already got a plan in place to execute it. And I talked about this earlier, the type of people I will emphasize again, really evaluating what your business will look like in the future. Do your people have the skills necessary, and where are their gaps? There may be people out there who become available at this time who are very good at what they do and may be able to help your organization either fill a gap or maybe an upgrade to people you have currently. Really assessing your talent at this point in time and having a good plan is an opportunity that isn't going to come along very often. And if you're a company that works off of a backlog, be mindful of burning it up too quickly. We were talking to a professional services company about 3 weeks ago, and they'd been shut down for a period of time. They've had a bunch of work build up. And if they call everybody back off layoff, there's the potential they'll have what's called the W, that they burn off the backlog and then they may have to go into a second round of layoffs. And they want to avoid that, obviously, because of all of the negative things that go along with laying people off. So managing the timing and the extension of work for companies with a backlog is going to be critical going out of the crisis. And the operating model that you end up with, so how you manage your cash, how you go about generating revenue, how you ramp up, are all things that are in the works, but it will be your new way of doing things at some point in time. One thing to consider is mapping out every customer touch point. How are you going to replace those interactions that you had with people along that sales journey? Still ensuring that you're going to be as effective as possible. What new things may you have to add in? What things can you drop out? And at some point, as I said, this is going to be your new way of doing things. So keep in mind that your policies and procedures that you've got today probably aren't relevant, but at some point in time, you're going to get back to wanting to add to those things and make them reflect the new reality. So I think there are four things, four fundamentals that come out of the different types of plans. One is that history is a poor guide for planning currently, but that doesn't mean that we can't plan. The plan, though, has to be detailed if it's going to be effective. The more detailed it is, the higher the degree of probability you'll survive, thrive, or thrive sooner than you may otherwise have. There are all these pressures on costs going up, revenues going down. focusing on process optimization, putting a large amount of effort on the way that you're delivering goods and services and making sure that you're pulling waste out as quickly and as much of it as possible. And then lastly, putting in place a means of tracking the costs, the activities, so that you have a true understanding of where you're making and losing money, and it gives you better information to make decisions going forward. So I want to thank Peter Herniak from our organization, who put a lot of this content together, our president, Mark Follows, Doug Robinson, who's our conduit with CEO Connections. I mentioned at the beginning that this is one of 3 webinars, and you will see a notice come out in the not too distant future about the other 2, how to execute and how to manage. And I'll put this offer out. If anyone wants to use us as a resource to just have a conversation about the plans that you're making for your organization, whether you want to pick our brains on what other companies are doing, what we're seeing as best practices, we can offer you an opinion. Please use us as a resource. You've got our contact information there on the last slide. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
You can use your raise hand icon to see who has a question, and I'll enable the speaking feature. There's one. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. You talked about the need to measure things. I find we measure too much as it is now. How would you suggest getting around that?
It's a common problem. I would suggest there's a methodology that we call the rule of 1, and take all of that mess of things that you've got that you could potentially be measuring, figure out what a 1% improvement is in any one of those indicators. That will give you the financial impact of improving by 1%. The next step would be asking yourself, what is realistically available in terms of the amount of improvement? So it might be 5% or 10%, whatever the number is. When you marry the value of 1% with the opportunity available, you'll see now a separation amongst all of those indicators as to which ones are the most impactful. So that would be my first advice. And then the second is to choose one indicator at least from 5 different categories: cost, quality, schedule attainment, health and safety, and customer and/or employee experience. And then that way you're not doing one or improving one part of the business to the detriment of another.
We now have a question from Joe Golden.
Thanks, Andrew. Question for you about furloughs. Is that something, should you try and hang on to your folks? You talked about burning through the backlog. Should you try and hang on to your folks as long as possible, or do you sometimes have to make the cuts as quickly as possible?
I'll answer it, and then I'll put an asterisk beside it. Everything that I've said, there's always an exception to every rule. But if I was going to follow one principle, I would follow this: that quick, decisive action now will give you more flexibility in the future. And I don't mean that to sound unempathetic, but if you want your organization to be as healthy as possible in the future, you are going to have to most likely incur some degree of pain now. I wouldn't delay on having that occur. It means that you might be in a position to bring people back sooner. I also believe that it's amazing how when you reduce the amount of people in any group and ask them to still do the same amount of work, they usually find a way of doing it. So for those 2 reasons, I would say do it sooner rather than later.
Andrew, if I could, hey Joe, it's Mark. A lot of people coming out of the 2008 recession reflected on it and came to the conclusion that earlier and more decisive would have been better for them had they been able to go back and do it. So I agree with what Andrew just said. And if you can, if you have a reasonable plan out into the future, that would also dictate and weigh that decision. So if you're going to come out of this with a smaller backlog or a lower revenue stream, then you want to try and size it to that as quickly as possible. Granted that you probably don't know what it is, but if you could, that's exactly what you would do.
Thank you.
Joe, any other questions from the group? Got one via the chat setting, Andrew and Mark. I'm finding it challenging to motivate my team and keep them focused.
I guess the question is how. I'm assuming. I'll take the first stab at that. You know, I don't want to sound like all of the articles out there, but they are true. The more often that you are interacting with your people, particularly the ones that are working remotely, the more you're going to make them feel included, the more up to date they're going to feel as to what's going on, what may be going on. You just present the opportunity for them to ask questions that you may not think that they have. So increasing the amount of touch points you have, even if you have nothing to talk about, the people that work for you you want to give them that opportunity to do so. I'd say if there's one thing to help keep them engaged, that would be the biggest one.
I'll add to that one too. The businesses that have strong cultures or strong value systems will have a better shot at maintaining a candid, transparent communication with its team. So the degree to which you communicate has to be amped up significantly, and the degree to which you have a strong value system within the business will dictate how successful that communication is. So a lot of that has already been sowed. You can't do much about the value system. It's either there or it's not, but certainly more communication is critical.
We have a question from Chris Betsiga asking if the content of the presentation will be shared afterwards, either through this deck or a link to the recording.
Both will be definitely on our website, and I'll have to check with Kenny. I believe CEO Connections will also have a copy of both.
Question, live question from Chris this time.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, guys.
Hey, Chris.
Time no talk. I don't know if you've heard or if maybe Ken's heard, we went through early indicators. A lot of our customers are in retail. So back in mid-March, we did some deep cuts proactively to the workforce. Applied through PPP, was granted PPP, but now they keep changing the goalposts. So we brought not everyone, brought most people back in preparation with the start of the PPP program, raised hours, reduced the diminished wages, all under the guise of what was going to be reimbursable. And now they just keep releasing around if you had access to other liquidity, even if you're running at a loss. Has anyone heard anything more about it from your other peer groups or clients you're talking to, if there's any other concern? Because right now I've brought everyone back, and my concern is, the SBA or the Fed may be changing the goalposts, and I can't keep bouncing back and forth like a seesaw.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, nothing, Chris. It's same here. We it's a moving goalpost, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think that wraps us up. Thank you everyone for joining. Please remember, we're always here to help. As Andrew mentioned, we're happy to have a discussion and talk through your plans with you and give you some opinions. And hopefully this has been insightful for everyone, and that you've got a couple takeaways to make your business better. Thanks for joining everyone, and we look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Thank you.